Well, friends, let's begin with admitting that this is a complex passage, a metaphysical passage, one that is hard to grasp with the rational mind, one that has been misunderstood and misused for the centuries, and now it's our turn to try not to misuse it. My hope today is to give you some perspective, some entry into what Paul was trying to convey that means something to you right now. Not an idea or belief, but a tangible reality in the midst of all these strange words that the rational mind cannot grasp. For instance, we hear him say, he is the image of the invisible God. That does not mean that God has a beard and sandals and is a man. That would be a sad and literalistic misunderstanding. To be the image of that which has no image requires of us to go deeper. How is the Anointed One, the image, the representation, the one who can show us something of that which cannot be known, of the mystery at the heart of all things? That's a big order, wouldn't you say? But that's the whole point of this Yeshua announced for thousands of years, who would come into this world, who would be in this world, who would be one of us, to enable each of us in our own way to grasp the ungraspable. To be the image of the invisible God means to live in a state of compassion, of amazing forgiveness, of self-transcendence, of self-sacrificial love. Don't you see those attributes of the man Jesus are reflections of the nature of the Creator? It doesn't make him the only religious icon compared to others. It simply is the explosive revelation that each of us has to take to heart, not as a doctrine, but as an experience. So let's try, without getting too complicated, without getting a headache, to understand the beauty and wonder of this. We're told, for in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. He himself is before all things. So we're talking about a consciousness that encompasses all the material world and the universe, as opposed to the Greek philosophers who separated the material as evil and the spirit as good. Perhaps some of you studied that in college. There was the soul and the body. Don't like the body, body bad, soul good. What dear Paul is giving us is a holistic representation, one who encompasses the material world and the spiritual world. That the incarnation of spirit in matter is the most mystical thing you can imagine. And it's especially mystical because it's about you, not merely about him. That's what we're going to head for. We're told he's the head of the body, the church, not the church made out of concrete, falling apart over here and there, needing some plumbing. The church, ecclesia, the assembly of those who are called out. You who are yearning for something more. You who know that the world out there in its vileness and vulgarity, mean-spiritedness and everything else isn't right, isn't as it should be. You who know deep inside, from the beauty that is in the world, that we should be people of peace and goodness. That's the church. That's the assembly of those called out from those who don't realize this, from those who are only interested in themselves. And he is the head. What does that mean? You remove the head and you're not very useful, are you? Not a whole lot you can do without it. Unfortunately, the French Revolution knew that only too well. The head directs, the head guides. The head is where it all happens. We are the rest of it. So we must submit to the fact that this church, any church, is not our church. Not your church, not my church. It's the church of Jesus Christ, the universal church, just as it was from the beginning. And we fit in under that spiritual leadership. And when that's forgotten, friends, that's when we get the creepy social clubs passing themselves off for what they're not, and then they die. We have a chance now to be alive in Christ by knowing whose we are and why we're here. Paul tells us, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Beautiful words, fullness of God. A little complicated for 21st century thinkers, but I'll tell you what, the quantum physicists are beginning to get it. It used to be science and religion were separate, unnecessarily. Now they're merging. They're merging because reality tells us at the subatomic levels that we are all connected. In other words, the fullness of the universe is in you too. Did you know that? It's hard to tell when you're just having breakfast and going through your routine that you are that drop in the ocean that contains the entire ocean. You just don't know it. Just as we only use 10% of the brain, we all know that. We haven't even begun to discover our deeper identity, the channel through which the power of Spirit itself can come through us. This is what Paul is telling us. Let me prove it to you. Through him, God was pleased to reconcile himself to all things by making peace through the blood of the cross. Friends, we have to understand that. It is so simplistic to assume that what he means is, okay, he got beaten and nailed and all those horrible things that perhaps some of you unfortunately witnessed in the movie, worshiping the tortured body on the cross. That is a tiny dimension. The blood of the cross is the self-sacrificial love that includes all of the teaching, all of the goodness that Christ brought. Here comes the man foretold by prophets who breaks all the rules and regulations of what religion is. Now that's a paradox, don't you think? The man from God, the man filled with God consciousness, unlike any other, comes in and breaks all the religious rules, the kosher rules, the whole issue of women in the first century. I've told you this before. There's a rabbinical saying, are you ready for this? That it is better to burn the Torah than to give it to a woman. All right? That was the religion of the times. And Jesus surrounded himself with women. He came to revolutionize the limitations, the rules and regulations that turned religion into just a human-made box in which we tried to capture God. He wanted us to have direct access to the power and spirit of the Holy. And he goes on to point right at us. He says, and you who were once estranged, another word is excluded, and hostile in mind, another translation, enemies in mind. Yes, all of us. Maybe we've come to church all our lives, and so we figure we have our passport stamped. But we are enemies in mind when we choose to live a mean-spirited life. Let there be no mistake about that. Enemies of God. Excluded from God's infinite desire to fill us with God's love. That's why we have to be vigilant. That's why we have to pay attention. That's why we can't let just anything rule our minds, or we will fall into enmity with God, self-destruction. You know, sin is so often misunderstood as a laundry list of what you shouldn't do. But it's much worse than that. Listen now. Sin, that word we don't like much anymore, is the refusal of God's grace. Not only rebellion against God, but refusing the grace of God in your life. And that's simple math, friends. That leads to nothing but one thing: self-destruction. And I'm sure a few of you know people who have self-destructed. We need that grace. It is offered to us. What are we waiting for? So look at a man for whom every minute of every day was an awareness of God, a dependence on God, a speaking to God, a hearing from God. Not that he was a magic man, a mystical man. He was just fully dedicated. And he knew time was short, as it is for every one of us. And that gave him that urgency to be in touch with Spirit. And friends, I say to you, he has in spirit to bless us all as a brother in Christ, to discover what he discovered in his fears of service and loving God. He has now reconciled his fleshy body through death to present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before God. Now, friends, there's nothing sadder than what is called cheap grace. To think that we can remain as we've always been, from the infant only interested in being fed, which is natural, to the teenager rebelling, to the adult all uptight and worried about paying the bills, and think that we will cross that threshold of glory, that we will be filled with the reality of God, live the divine life now without any efforts, is a terrible mistake. Notice there's a verb here in the middle of that sentence. Maybe you missed it when it was being read. Provided. Provided. You all know what that means. As long as you continue securely established and steadfast in the faith without shifting, making the faith your foundation. And I want you to take an example in your life. Everybody has one where something is hard to deal with. And notice in that situation you're in and struggling with, that just maybe you've left God out of the equation. And what does it mean to bring God in the equation? Inner peace in the midst of turmoil. A strange joy even though you're not getting anything you want. This is what the teaching is, because we have access to the life-giving power of life itself. It's like plugging into the great generator of life. In our sadness, in our fears, we can be re-empowered. We can choose between faith in the reality and goodness of God and fear in our loneliness. Choose faith in the name of God. And Paul goes on, I'm now rejoicing in my sufferings. No, this is not some bizarre masochistic ancient faith and completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. That's pretty weird. But think of it this way. Every act of kindness that you do, every extra effort that you make for another is continuing Christ's presence in the world. You're suffering from lack of appreciation while you're doing good. Anybody know that one? Your motivation being right and misunderstood. You complete the suffering of the Holy One, the Pure One, right here, right now, in your little life, you continue the journey of Christ in the world. How's that for a purpose in this life? And he goes on to say that the mystery that has been hidden through the ages and generations has now been revealed to the saints. Another word is to those who belong to him. Not special chosen people, but those who say yes. Those who are willing to let go of their locked-in pride, of their self-interest, of their old habits. Those who are willing to open the doors and let themselves be found. To them is revealed the secret of the ages. And what is the secret of the ages? I went through multiple translations because these complex ideas have to be approached in so many ways, and French is a very clear language. So here it is in French. Et voici le secret, le Christ est en vous. And here is the secret. Christ is in you. The secret of the ages. We are dwelling places of spirit. We're not just mortal creatures. We are meant to be spiritual creatures, conscious of the reality and intimacy of God. Firstborn means that Christ came to be the first among many, and you're the many. And that gives you purpose, that gives you meaning, that gives you power you couldn't imagine to do good, to forgive, to start again. You are tapped into the power of the universe. If you will transcend your sense of little self, that little thing that gossips and complains and all of that oh so human little tiny thing, and discover your true identity. Child of God, son and daughter of God, living the life of Christ in your way, in this time, with the faith of Christ. That's the promise and the journey